Welcome to this Euronews event organized with the support of Meta, where we will discuss the challenges and opportunities Europe is facing when it comes to innovation and technology. I am Cynthia Groot, Senior Tech Journalist with Euronews in Brussels. And let me first introduce the topic that we will discuss today more in depth. Competitiveness has been a hot topic in Brussels ever since the Mario Draghi report came out last year. The report said that Europe needs to innovate more to keep up with the other regions in the world and that it's lacking competitiveness. During this panel, we'll look at what's at stake and what it means in practice for companies operating in Europe. So let me first introduce the panelists that will address this topic. We have Darius Standerski, Secretary of State at Poland's Ministry of Digital Affairs, Zach Helzer, Senior Director for Europe at the US Chamber of Commerce, Marcus Reinisch, Vice President for Public Policy for Meta in Europe, and Claudia Dollins, Vice President Precision Medicines at GSK. Well, welcome to all of you. Let's dive into the discussion. Maybe first with a round of opening statements to set the scene. The first 100 days of this European Commission have now passed. When it comes to tech, they have presented this AI Continent Action Plan aimed at boosting the uptake of this technology. So what do you think that this Commission has done that can bring the continent forward when it comes to tech innovation? Should we be optimistic? So for all of you to reply to this, maybe starting with you, Darius, please go ahead.
First of all, good to be here, and thank you for this opportunity to comment not only 100 days of the European Commission, but also more than a half of Polish presidency in the European Union Council. And this time, 3 months and a couple of days, I can observe the dramatic change, the dramatic shift in the approach on technology and investments as well. Because since the December 2024, we've observed many, not only plans, but already new investments. Just for example, the AI Factories network. Suddenly, within weeks or so, we've seen 13 AI factories all across Europe that will spread the computational power across not only public administration, but also academia and entrepreneurs. And now we have the second step, because the European Commission already published the Gigafactory plan, which is not doubling the computational power. Will have 500% more of its power because of gigafactories. So that's the first observation, that we came from plans to operation. The second to observe is that we have also a change in the financial framework approach, because President von der Leyen also announced closer cooperation between public and private sectors in terms of financing infrastructural investments as well. We've seen AI investment plan, and mentioned a Gigafactories plan also includes involvement from the private sector. And after this involvement, it also includes the share of public and private sector in this new asset for technological infrastructure. That's the second. And the third observation is coming from the whole legislative package of digital solutions to simplification. 2 weeks ago, I hosted the round table between European Commission, Presidency, and representatives of entrepreneurs associations. And as I've heard, that was held for the first time in the history in the topic of simplification. And now we will put on the table the whole simplification package to make the coherent legal system in the digital area from those packages that we had in 5 years from now. So we've seen the shift of the approach, the change of the perspective in those three fundamental areas. So I'm more optimistic than I was 3 months ago, and I hope this trend will prevail and will go in this direction in following months and years.
Great, thank you. Claudia, what's your take on this?
I want to echo the sentiment of positivity and optimism. So thank you first and foremost for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today and have the opportunities to participate in this event. So I work in the pharmaceutical industry, so I guess my statements will very much so refer to developments in the that pertain and impact the ways of working in the pharmaceutical industry, of course. And first of all, I want to acknowledge the efforts to address critical challenges in the current EU infrastructure and barriers to competitiveness, including the openness to address regulatory complexity. In particular, there I want to highlight the willingness to address some of the complexities in the clinical trials regulation. We're particularly excited about developments in the development of a new life science strategy. Ultimately, we do believe that that's a strong move to set clear strategic direction. But we also want to highlight the fact that this must be ultimately backed with the ability to drive stronger policy coherence and alignment. And finally, perhaps I want to add excitement about the AI Content Action Plan earlier this month, and we really hope that this will bring additional clarity and strategy to European Commission's thinking around tech innovation. So as part of that plan, we particularly appreciate the big emphasis in AI and science, such as also highlighted in the European Strategy for AI and Science. And we are very glad that the European Commission is really moving quickly to release the data unionization strategy this summer. So obviously the data AI model connection is a very inherent one, and harmonization in this place is going to be a key enabler for innovation. Thank you.
That's great. Dag, do you share this optimism?
Yes, actually. Europe is trying to reset. The acknowledgement that the reset is needed in and of itself is certainly a meaningful and welcome signal. I work at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're the world's largest business organization. U.S. companies are heavily invested in Europe's success. Europe's prosperity is in our shared collective interest. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. So to the extent that we're being candid, we're also being constructive. We want to be part of the solution. So looking at the actual output, the AI Continent Plan was mentioned, designed to reassert European competitiveness, particularly in the AI space. Proposes some significant investments that Darius already spoke about, gigafactories, AI factories to support R&D and startups. But the numbers don't necessarily match the ambition. And just for perspective, last year alone, private U.S. investment in AI reached almost $70 billion, and that's several times what it was in Europe. And in terms of outcomes last year, the US produced dozens of state-of-the-art foundation models. China produced about a dozen, and Europe, 2 or 3 really, and most of those from France. So yes, the ambition is there. It's hugely appreciated, but the follow-through doesn't necessarily, move the needle yet. And we want to work together with Europe to get there. The simplification agenda is another example. It's a great headline. We certainly are very interested in simplification and want to work together. But one issue is that it only covers laws already on the books, and it doesn't address the underlying machinery that keeps generating these new layers of regulation from Brussels. So there needs to be an emergency brake or a mechanism that stops this political momentum from driving through regulatory proposals that aren't fit for purpose. And so if Europe is really serious about tech competitiveness and innovation leadership. In our view, it needs to be just as bold in removing friction as it is in introducing new rules.
Great. We're definitely going to touch upon those topics further on. But first, hear from Marcus.
Well, I mean, I'm just a general optimist, but I would say that clearly there have been ambitions and actions and announcements of Europe, which is obviously very positive. And I also see that we are sort of slowly moving on from the debate that sort of was initially very much in how do we optimize for risk avoidance, how do we embrace caution, and not so much looking into the lost opportunities of not looking into innovation and embracing innovation technology. I think we're moving on from this one, and this is a positive development. But a little bit building on Zach here is it enough if we look at the broader context of how Europe is developing in comparison to its peers, how it's developing for its businesses? And I think the actions do not necessarily reflect the criticality where we are. And we see that the technology debate has been lifted dramatically up over the last weeks, month, where technology is also now a part of the trade relationships that Europe has with one of its biggest trading partners. But it also has geopolitical consequences. And the perception that we need to have technology built on Western values. And by not supporting that, you explicitly or implicitly support technology that, for example, is built on Chinese values. So I think there is a much, much bigger context. There's not just, do we need to make incremental changes? And the trajectory is still a negative one for Europe. We're still falling behind. We're still falling behind with GDP growth. We are still falling behind with productivity. We're still falling behind with investing in the future for the AI, for example, and the amount of AI investment that Europe does in comparison to China or the US is just a minor fragment of that one. So I think we are, we're not necessarily seeing that negative trend is not a linear one, is actually one that accelerates. And we're falling further back behind the US, we're falling further back behind China, we're falling further back potentially or getting closer to India, to the Middle East. And again, I don't think that the measures announced are really addressing the criticality, the importance of where we are right now.
Right. Well, you mentioned trade, and just to maybe address the elephant in the room, yesterday Meta was fined, received one of the first Digital Markets Act fines, 200 million euros. Do you think that would put a strain on the EU relationship with the Trump administration, who said that retaliation will follow in case US companies are hit with such fines?
Look, I think, again, working together between the US and Europe at the moment is one of the most important things, because this is not just a trade issue. This is a geopolitical issue, as I mentioned before. And I think every friction that is built between that relationship is not conducive for Europe specifically. I think the framework of Europe, I don't think necessarily, and the regulatory framework builds a strain between Europe and the US. What I do think is an issue is the application of that framework and the discriminatory application of the framework. And that is a problem, and you might have seen the reaction of the White House yesterday to the fines. And by the way, the fines are one part of the decision, but it's actually the much, much smaller part. It is the decisions where the European Commission is impacting in the most severe way a business model, a legitimate business model, not just of us, but also of other American players, and the impact, the multiply impact that has for European businesses that want to compete, that want to grow, that, for example, a European business earns for every euro they spend, €4 on advertising on our platforms, hampering that and thereby kneecapping Europe even further in this competition that we're currently losing out with other regions is quite irresponsible, not just with regards to us, not just with regards to the relationship that we have with our strongest partner, the US, but actually with the responsibility that Europe has towards its citizens and its businesses to grow, to prosper, and to be successful.
Jump on how to move on from that later on in the panel. Maybe first to address the issue of artificial intelligence. It's often named as one of the examples where other regions in the world are doing more. Europe is regulating and not innovating. companies might leave elsewhere to the US, for example, where they can grow easier. Zach, is that what you're hearing too from companies?
Sure, absolutely. The AI Act, is the law of the land. It's finalized. It's being implemented as we speak. It sets a global precedent, but not in the way that Europe hoped. And we and so many others have expressed deep concerns that it will limit development and hinder the deployment of AI technologies in Europe, like what Marcus was just talking about. And it's not just fines. Beyond compliance costs, there's legal ambiguity, third country obligations. It's not a framework that supports rapid and responsible innovation. The general purpose AI code of practice only makes it harder on top of that. It's also vague. There's overlapping obligations for developers and deployers, including those using open source models. It's just Europe's approach is not aligned with how these systems are actually built, tested, and deployed. I think it just reflects a fundamental disconnect between Brussels and the real world AI development lifecycle, and it doesn't include the general purpose AI code of practice doesn't really include the policy guardrails either that would prevent the code from becoming mandatory even before parts of the AI Act are implemented. So U.S. companies are already starting to not provide new updated models, in the EU due to the regulatory environment. And that's something that I experience when I go to Europe. Apps are, not working as well as they do at home here in Washington. So without the EU taking, real corrective measures, to Marcus's point, Europe will not be a global leader in AI. And this isn't data protection. I know we all know this. I'm stating the obvious, but AI is such a fundamentally different technology. The pace that it's moving is exponentially faster than anything we've ever dealt with, and that really requires dynamic and responsive governance. So if Europe continues to overregulate, like Marcus said, that space that opens up won't remain empty. It's going to be filled, by countries like China and not like-minded democratic partners.
Things that Darius, you mentioned in your opening remarks is also more public and private investment from Europe into AI, for example, setting up these gigafactories. What is it that you're hearing? I mean, Poland is hosting one of those AI factories. Do you think that they would meet the demand that companies have currently?
Yeah, of course. First of all, let me have a remark on the previous comments that we have two issues here. First issue is the need to simplify our regulations. There is need to go from the 19th century procedures to 21st century technologies, and that's obvious. But on the other hand, those slogans like other countries are innovating and Europe is regulating are also stereotypes and not really positive ones, because as I remember, one of the first executive orders by President Trump revoking AI regulations in the United States. So it reminds us that there were some AI regulations in the United States before. There are regulations on the AI in China. And beside those simplification needs that we see and we react, there is still not only regulation in the European continent, but also those heavy investments such as AI factories. And they are of the vital importance, especially because they are opening the possibility for example, and first of all, smaller and medium entrepreneurs to test and run AI models and systems afterwards, suited for their mode of operation. And that's how those changes in the supply will be welcomed by the demand from the economy. Because we also conducted a survey among our entrepreneurs in Poland, and we've seen that more than 600,000 only Polish entrepreneurs plan in the nearest quarter or two to invest in cloud and AI solutions. So that's not the matter of opinions. That's the matter of the survey and of math, that this new supply will be answered by new demand in Poland and in other countries, because as we've seen many of research pieces right now, everyone is clear that AI solutions will enhance productivity of entrepreneurs, and those entrepreneurs see those research. So that's why they will answer for this new computational power. And wherever I am in Poland or other countries in Europe, entrepreneurs even now ask me how they will get to this supercomputer near their operation sites, and that's a very good sign. That's a very good sign, because our awareness is growing, and I'm sure that our investments will be full of new tasks, increasing our productivity.
Would you like to react to that? Because this is a national story, and like it works for SMEs, maybe not so much for big tech companies. Meta has rolled out Meta AI recently in Europe, but the company said it happened a lot later than in the US. Are you afraid that the same situation might happen with other tools that you want to roll out in Europe, and that there will be delays?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big concern, obviously, for us. But again, it should be a much bigger concern for every single European, that we are now second-class citizens because we have to wait 12, 18 months to get something that everybody else has in the world, and quite often to a lesser quality or lesser capability. And that's not because of us, that we sort of sit there and say, no, this part of the world doesn't get it. It's because we are held back by this one. And I just want to make one thing clear. I actually don't disagree with this juxtaposition between innovation and regulation. It does require regulation. I think we all have to understand this. European citizens, the fundamental interests and rights of citizens have to be protected through regulation and digital regulation. And there's absolutely no debate about this. And we as companies need regulation to have certainty and sometimes also protection from other very dominant players in that market that we depend on. So regulation is important. The problem is a slightly different one, I think. At the moment, we have 100 plus tech regulations in Europe. That is an enormous amount. Yeah? And we can discuss that if that's too many or not enough, whatever. But just think about what the entry barrier is for companies that are not as large as ours into the market that have to deal with this. But again, that is not the issue. The issue is that we are dealing with 270 regulators in Europe that try to double guess, interpret these quite often overlapping regulations. And they have their own interpretations, they have their own agendas. And that is the big problem of regulation. That is the much bigger problem than the myriad of pieces of regulation that we have, because there is absolutely no standardization, no harmonization about Europe. The second problem is this completely strange ambition to be first to regulate something. And that I really do not understand, and I think that's enormous harm. Is this competition, this race for that? I think that makes no sense. And then the third one, bringing us back to the question you asked me before, which is, I think, an ever bigger problem that some well-meant regulation is implemented in a discriminatory manner. And that harms, obviously, our businesses, and I'm sure not too many people shed too many tears about this, but the knock-on effect that has, the knock-on effect of the businesses that want to compete with European incumbencies, for example, that want to compete across borders despite all the barriers that European businesses have to be single market companies, that want to be successful, that want to have a return of investment of 1 to 4 when they adverse. that is the real problem of competition, of regulation, that is sort of singling out certain platforms, certain non-European platforms, and holding them back and holding Europe back at the same time.
And Claudia, AI is also coming up more in the medical industry. Is that also something you're seeing that other regions are developing faster than Europe when it comes to tech?
So maybe I want to take a step back on this. So obviously, yes, in the pharmaceutical sector, AI plays a tremendously important role. Facilitating anything from what we've heard previously, facilitation of operational tasks, all the way to actually being leveraged for informing patient care, right? So very different scenarios, very different applications. And so, introduction of regulation in that space per se is actually, in my mind, not a bad thing. And maybe I'm a bit biased as a caveat. I am a former regulator. So I do think regulation itself can be a vehicle to actually drive innovation and provide clarity ultimately. Now, this is in the context of AI is obviously very complex because AI is the technology, but then ultimately can be applied to very many different elements, such as operational management or patient care. Again, very different applications. So, interpretation of regulation and clarity on where these regulations apply and where they don't apply often can actually be quite a driver for innovation. For example, we've seen EU's exemption on AI for R&D as part of the AI Act. So again, that's also actually really helpful guardrails that then are being established through regulation. So it's always, I guess, somewhat easy to pick apart regulation if somebody's going first and takes the first step, right? So I think that's actually for us a good point to start a discussion and help regulators understand where the sticking points are. And I do appreciate this, that there seems to be openness from the side of the European Commission to engage in such interactions to help us to kind of tailor regulations or interpretations of regulations going forward to make sure that they're ultimately going to be fit for purpose. Again, we definitely want to acknowledge the fact that this is a tremendous effort. But there's also, we need to retain the openness to address the regulatory complexity, as we already heard. There's, for a particular application, for example, in the medical device space, you have multiple sets of regulations, IVD regulations, medical device regulations, clinical trials regulations, AI Act, right? How do those all coalesce? What are the relevant elements? So some delineation and simplification would be well appreciated, and for sure, stronger policy coherence and having some more streamlined interpretations of such complex regulations, particularly if you have multiple relevant regulations applying to one single product or one single application of a product, would be very helpful. So, I guess in summary, regulation in itself is not bad. It's not necessarily stifling innovation. In fact, it can be a driver of innovation. However, if it's too broadly applied, if there's lack of clarity with interfaces of different pieces of regulations, those can for sure be halt innovation in the long term.
We'll get to simplification later in this panel, but maybe first, how to improve this EU-US relationship. It seems to be fading with increasing criticism of this Trump administration on EU rules, on the Digital Services Act, the AI Act that we mentioned already. So where would you be able to find a middle ground, let's say? Maybe Zach, would you like to react to this?
Sure. We all, acknowledge that the transatlantic relationship is under. Said that transatlantic tech relationship is also under pressure. There is a strong perception from the U.S. business community that Europe, regulates first, coordinates later, if at all. We're not seeing regulatory alignment. We're seeing divergence. And in some cases, a lack of reciprocity. And, Marcus, touched on this earlier. The DMA is a perfect case in point. the way it's being interpreted really feels more like targeted enforcement than balanced oversight. And I think we all know there's a real risk of trade escalation here. And I'm hoping that we can all agree the faster we move toward de-escalation, the better. And again, this is coming from, a US business perspective. We are, Europe's partners and allies, emphasizing again my first answer. We're deeply invested in Europe's success. And Europe's prosperity is in our collective interest. And so, being constructive, as friends, that really requires, Europe to recognize that its rules just don't operate in a vacuum. These decisions affect global markets, global partners, and the global innovation ecosystem. Europe is really at a crossroads that, there's a choice here. We want to work together. Don't isolate yourselves. And if Europe doesn't want to work, with U.S. business and, continue with these, exorbitant fines, and U.S. companies, are, much slower because of the regulatory environment in terms of, getting their products to EU, and, Marcus's point about second-class citizens, that, the products that I enjoyed, my friends in Europe don't. Others are more than happy to fill that gap. That's clear. And, we want to help local communities across Europe thrive. We believe in free, open, competitive markets, but the regulatory environment really needs to reflect that same spirit.
Maybe Darius, you would like to react to this. I mean, there was a forum for discussion, let's say, between the EU and the US under the previous Commission and US administration, this Trade and Technology Council, the TTC. Would it be better to have something in place like that again, to at least have a dialogue? What's your take on that?
Of course, I'm a big fan of strong ties and cooperation between the United States and the European Union, and that's obvious because we are and we should be still the closest allies. Not only because of our strong European market, but also because of our shared values. However, again, we have a couple of independent issues here, because one issue is about regulation and possible simplification, another is about enforcement. And in terms of enforcement, there is no situation where all sides are happy with the sentence. And we have the same situation here with DMA case. We have probably similar situation in the US in antitrust case. So it's not the sole problem of the enforcement in the European Union. And another case, it's about, as you've said, possible trade isolation. We need to remind ourselves that it's not European Union that started this discussion about tariffs. It's not the European Union that started this shift that some comments that it's the trade war. It's not Europe's reason, and it's not our side to be threatened by trade isolation. So we are in a slightly different situation here. However, I see a lot of possible fields of cooperation, and I see even fields when we can enhance our cooperation. For example, our defense systems, our dual use products and services. I see not only after Secretary Hesget's visit to the European Union, but also in contact with the current President Trump administration, I see that we have new possibilities to work on, because we need to distinguish we can call it big politics and big statements about tariffs or cooperation with this country, and the second very important, sometimes even more important part of our cooperation, the daily work between our departments, and this diligent work between our clerks, working on new ways of cooperation, working on the new possible common initiatives between the European Union and the United States. And from my perspective, what's the best for them? It's to allow them work closely, work without any rush, and we will see those effects, I believe, in following months. Because we need to remember that it's not only European Commission that's new. This whole the U.S. administration is also new in their posts, and they need to make them acquainted with the job. They need to sum up all those things that has been done and has been not done in the last years. I remember when I came to the government, I needed 3 to 6 months to be on the board with every issue I have. So let's give both the US and European administration to work closely, work without any rush.
So would you like to react to that? Like what needs to happen right now to improve this relationship?
Is that towards me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, there's not much more to say. I mean, if there is the perception that American companies are singled out, that European companies remain untouched, that Chinese companies have a much lighter treatment than US companies, I mean, how can you expect that enhances the relationship between two very powerful economic regions? You know, that's it. But I think we need to sort of, and there is, I would disagree a little bit with this notion this is completely new. And maybe it is new that the US has a laser sharp focus to say, we want to maintain our leadership in the technology space. We want to enhance that leadership in the technology space, because that has been the sector that pretty much single-handedly has contributed to the prosperity, to the growth of prosperity of the United States, and has led to this strength of that base. So why would you want to relinquish that to China or to another place? So being laser focused on that one and seeing everything that is undermining and detracting from this leadership and from this great desire to want to keep this position here, I think that should not be seen as sort of a crazy one-off. And we have this. I really struggle to see any current or future US administration to go back on this one and say, look, we actually don't care about this anymore. You know, Europe, do whatever you want to do with these guys. This is it. I think that the past maybe was a little bit of an aberration, but that is very much the status quo I think that we are in. And there is so much to play for between Europe and the US. There's so much room for cooperation. And I do think that we're really making it very, very difficult to see that. And there's voices, this is not just me saying this. There are voices within the member states. There are voices even within the European Commission who say, God, we should work and cooperate so much more to build Western technology together and to not let China win this race here. And this is a very, very serious and very realistic threat that is out there, specifically in the field of AI. So I think we should really move away and make our life much, much easier, not tripping ourselves up with unnecessary discriminatory behavior towards companies and entities that bring so much prosperity to Europe, so much productivity to Europe, and address so many problems. So I think it's really not sort of a weird reaction of the US in my view, and I'm absolutely certain that this is not something that will change radically over the next decades.
Brings us, I think, to the next topic about simplification. This European Commission will review most of its rules and to check if there's...
I can't hear you anymore.
For companies, which laws should they start with first? Maybe Zach would like to react to this.
Colleagues in Brussels say, vision for this channel, also good ideas. That said, the simplification effort applies to laws that exist. It's not, addressing the pipeline of new rules that will be, introduced and these underlying concerns that have been touched on, throughout the course of this debate. There is an appetite in Brussels to regulate and re-regulate. Like that's just the case. And until that impulse is balanced with more of a commitment to innovation, at least in the digital space, I'm somewhat concerned about, what simplification will really mean. Europe needs a new mindset, and, we want to work together to get there. One that evaluates success not by the quantity of rules adopted, but by the ease with which businesses can innovate, scale, and deploy new technologies. I think that point is so important. The AI Act needs a serious second look. There's no doubt about it. Same for the general purpose AI Code of Practice. They are well-intentioned efforts. No one's arguing that whatsoever. But they're vague, they're rigid, and counterproductive in the current environment that we're operating in. Going back to the last question and responses. Brussels, should be upfront about what's working and what isn't. And, Darius talking about, how, rethinking, how Brussels works, and, not just enforcement, but governance reform, could not agree more. Europe shouldn't shy away from being bold. That's what we expect. And I think that's what this, moment really demands. While there's significant challenge, there's also significant opportunity. And, when the Commission sets out to prioritize competitiveness, innovation, and digital leadership, we as partners and allies, want to hold you to that and support you and get there together.
Claudia, does it also apply to your industry? I mean, what would you say that can be cut or simplified in existing rules?
We only have 3 minutes, so I'll try to keep this short. But yeah, it absolutely applies to the pharmaceutical industry. We're seeing a lot of complexity in the regulatory authorization procedures, processes, timelines, right? So ultimately, there's a tremendous opportunity really here to achieve streamlining of procedures, have accountability and more clearly defined, have roles and responsibilities a bit more clearly defined, and allow for ultimately shorter review times and more predictable review activities. For example, we're seeing a lot of complexity in delineation between roles and responsibility between regulators and ethics committees. So things like that should be really clarified. There should be some centralization of those activities. And again, there needs to be clarity on who's making which decisions ultimately. I think my particularly where the space that I'm working in is really geared towards the incorporation of technology in the medicines product development. And there we have a combination ultimately of very many pieces of regulation coming together and leading to incredibly complex, long, clinical trial authorization procedures that are often redundant in nature. And so there are rich opportunities for streamlining. And as was said before, Zach said it really nicely, and this is a great time for Europe to actually make a mark and be bold and really rethink, what is working well, what is not working well, what is the core value of a regulation, and really focus on those pieces and remove a lot of the complexity that we're currently seeing.
Indeed, we're almost out of time, so maybe just before we wrap up, it would be great to hear from each of you, maybe a one-sentence closing remark. What should be the top priority to keep Europe innovative on tech and medication, in your case, Claudia? Maybe Darius, if you would like to start.
So to sum up this topic on simplification, what I strongly agree with Marcus is that it's ridiculous that in the European Union we implement the common law in 27 different ways. And we have hundreds of regulators within our countries. That needs to change, and that will be within our simplification package for the European Commission. We need to change this approach on regulating, especially digital issues in the European Union. We are the one union, and that's why we need to have a consistent legal system all across this continent.
Claudia, what should you say on this top priority for Europe?
Top priority is easy, difficult to say. Ultimately, Europe is at a crossroads, right? I think the comparison between the US and Europe is also not a fair one because it's one country versus many countries. Ultimately, but I think there's a recognition that we need to reestablish balance between regulation and ultimately safety and progress and innovation. There's a recognition of that, but we need to implement that and move towards that more quickly. So really the ambition should be on speed, making sure that, we identify hurdles to innovation quickly and remove them quickly.
Zach, what would you add to this?
Good at evaluating success, what I made earlier, not by the quantity is adopted, by the ease with which businesses can innovate, scale, and deploy new technologies. I think that sums it up.
And for you as well, Marcus?
Yeah, I keep it simple. I think we should really pause on new regulation in the digital sphere and really think what the impacts of current regulation has been. I think we should really, really look ourselves in the mirror and see where we have looked into where discrimination protectionism has sneaked into regulation. But then a more philosophical point. I really wish as a European that we fall back in love with wanting to live in the future again. And being maybe less prosaic, I think we have to give innovation a much more central point. It has, as Draghi said, has to become a pillar, a fundamental right of Europe. And I think we have done it in the past. We have been leading the mobile internet with 3G, Nokia, Ericsson. We could do that. I would like to go back to these times where we had this optimism, this spirit, this positivity. We can do it, and we should really concentrate more on the mentality than not just on simplification and other things.
Great to end on that note. So a big thank you to the speakers for joining me in this discussion, and also to everyone watching. Hope it's been insightful. Please check euronews.com for more stories on these topics, and have a nice rest of the day.